a talk at the Healthy Kids Collaborative meeting with Reese, one of the wonderful researchers from CAF who is working on a national study of the school food workforce with me that was funded by the US Department of Agriculture. And I met somebody who had been part of the inaugural fellowship program for a Healthy School Meals Pathway. And he showed me a matching tattoo that he and all the other cohort participants had gotten. They built some real camaraderie, I think, is what I took away from that in any case. But I have worked in the sort of broad world of school food research for about the last 13, 14 years now. And I'm currently at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, but have had the opportunity to travel quite a bit around the country to meet people who are doing really phenomenal things in school food programs, as well as looking at different countries around the world that have universal free school meals and that are doing things that I consider to be really exciting in terms of how they use public policy to really try to change what food systems look like, using school meals as a broader tool for really changing what their broader food systems look like domestically. Just a quick thing for me before I dive into things. Are all the apprentices from California who are on this call or different places?
We have the majority of them are from California, but we do have one apprentice from Colorado that I won't put on the spot, but
Ooh,
a
amazing.
little
Okay,
bit
cool.
of multi-state engagement on this call today.
Okay, awesome. Well, I will talk a tiny, tiny bit about both California and Colorado. So, hooray. All right, I have some slides that I'm going to share. I was asked to talk with you all today about the history behind school food in the United States. I know that you all had the opportunity to be thinking about that as part of your pre-work for today, but I wanted to highlight just a few things real quickly and then talk a little bit about some of the school food research that I'm currently leading. And I probably should have mentioned this during my bio, but I wrote a book that came out about 5 years ago called The Labor of Lunch: Why We Need Real Food and Real Jobs in American Public Schools. So for me personally, the kind of work that you all are doing to bring more scratch cooking into schools and to really elevate the valuable work that you all do in your communities is just so important for this broader effort to really maximize the public value of our school food programs for not only kids and families, but for our communities. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I did share with Emily the link to this, so you all should have access to these slides as well. Okay, so I wanted to just kick us off by sharing this picture. So this was the cover of Time magazine from the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, when people were talking a lot about essential workers and in particular the role of school food workers in making sure that not only kids were fed, but that families had more food security. And I think that for me, this is a really important visual reminder of the fact that school meals are an important form of not only food systems infrastructure in the United States, but of care infrastructure. And I think we even see that Emily opened us up today by talking about the fires in California. And I noticed I'm not there, I'm in Wisconsin, but that LA Unified had closed schools for many days, but even during those days of school closures, they had sites open where people could go and get meals. So I think that that's something that we see, that even when the rest of the educational enterprise may be shut down, that school meals are such an important thing for communities nowadays that they really are kind of treated differently. Yet at the same time, we know that school food workers tend to be the lowest paid employees in public school and private school settings. So I think part of what I'm going to try to talk about a little bit today is some of the history behind why the programs look the way that they do, and also some of the things that we are trying to do, I think, as researchers and advocates, including Chef Ann Foundation, to really try to draw attention to the need to really invest in equity for school food workers. One thing that I think has been really impactful in the world of school food advocacy, here I'm highlighting both Colorado and California, is all of the really tremendous work that's gone into creating universal free school meals. There are 8 states now that have permanent free school meals for all. And I think that some people think about this as like, wow, like, we had this experiment during the pandemic and suddenly we got to do this thing differently. Without necessarily knowing that this was actually part of the original vision of some of the founders of the first not for profit school meal programs in the United States. So they'd always wanted to really have as their ideal a universal free school meal program, but had to, in a lot of ways, make compromises based on what finances looked like and what various sort of political concerns may have been surrounding entitlements being universal versus means tested for families. So I think that we're at a really exciting point in school food history right now in our present because there's so much incredible activism going on to not only really try to expand access to school meals to all children, but to really question, well, what do we want these meals to look like? And what do we want the experience to be? How do we want the 20 billion plus dollars of federal funding we spend every year on school breakfast and lunch to be spent? Do we want that to go mainly to large scale manufacturers and commodity agriculture, or do we want it to go to build more local and resilient food systems? But at the heart of this conversation, in my view, we can't really transition what our school food programs look like or deliver really high quality product without having people who are able to work with more basic ingredients and develop recipes and execute those recipes in ways that are responsive to the needs of their local communities. And we can't expect people to stay in those jobs and to do that work if we're not creating viable career pathways. So I'm really excited that we're doing this work together today, and that y'all are in this program, and that this emphasis on workforce has really started to emerge within the last 10 years or so. All right, so super brief history about school lunch. I wanted to just share a couple pictures. So these are some pictures of the early home economists who started to really dream about what it would look like to feed children collectively and what it would look like instead of having individual parents or households be responsible for school meals to develop a really strong public system rooted in strong nutritional standards, food safety, but also really integrating the school food experience into the educational enterprise of the school. So they were really doing this work back in the late 1890s and through the 1920s. There was this kind of mass experimentation with building school meal programs that would be not for profit and really designed to really try to meet the needs of both children and working class women. So this is actually a picture from the early 1900s from the New England kitchen. These women here were actually repurposing large-scale industrial like laundry baskets to pack sandwiches and jugs of milk to take to Boston public schools. So for all intents and purposes, this was basically like the first central kitchen operation in the United States. And they had a real, I think, difficult time maintaining their independent management of this program. So even way back then, and when they wanted to have more communal character, there was this threat of like privatization and outsourcing to people who weren't necessarily engaged in the work. That said, the very first school lunches, I chose New York as an example here because I think it's an example that really preserved in a lot of ways like the community character. I wanted to just share that in their example, really working like at the community level, they were able to expand out working with volunteers, home economists, educators, and also philanthropists to serve over 800,000 free or low price lunches per year to children in New York City public schools. And importantly, in their model, they hired cooks from the community to prepare nutritionally balanced meals that were tailored to ethnic tastes and religious requirements. So at this point in American history, there was a lot of emphasis on what was called Americanization, and essentially this idea that you could sort of train people to conform to a certain set of taste preferences and way of being through food. And they didn't really subscribe to that model. They said, no, we know that the way to ensure that our children are actually going to eat the food is to be respectful of the food traditions that these children have at home. And we can do that within our nutritional parameters that we're trying to follow. So they built a really model program in New York and even had a really large children's farm. And throughout some of the early years of school food, we experienced kind of major challenges in the United States with food security during World War One, and there was a real sort of attempt to encourage people as part of this effort of patriotism to actually get involved in raising vegetables through school gardens and to use that produce in schools. And what we maybe talk about today as farm to school in some places was just sort of common practice in terms of how people treated some of their facilities as community assets. This is a picture showing a community canning enterprise that engaged both children as well as some of the women in the community in terms of making sure that they were able to preserve some of these products for later use. That said, a lot of the things that they were experimenting with during this time, so this vision for school meals during the progressive era, free lunches for all, school gardens, cooking classes, having canning and food preservation workshops, linking school food to topics related to health, nutrition, and biology, really engaging family and community, having children participate in meaningful ways, and also creating safe, high quality jobs for a primarily women workforce. Those were all things that were written about not only in New York, but also in Philadelphia public schools, which was another kind of leader at this point in time. But they really faced a lot of challenges with enacting this vision of having school lunch be this hub, so one of the arteries through which the active blood of cooperation runs. That's sort of how they thought about like the central role that school food could play. But at the same time, these early activists were really expected to run financially self-sustaining programs. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that requirement because it exists in most places today, where you get the reimbursement dollars from the federal government and whatever children and families are paying into your program. And that's your operating budget. And it's separate typically from the general education fund for the public schools. And that's really what ended up happening during the early 1900s. I have come across different publications from the government that talk about as early as like 1913, a standard practice being that these school meal programs would be financially self-sustaining through donations from the community, so relying on philanthropy and whatever payments, a modest amount of money that kids would be paying for meals if they could afford them. But it was like sort of this thing where they had to convince, oftentimes, the administrators to let them set up these experimental not for profit programs and to say, don't worry, we want to do this thing that we think will be good for children and families, but we won't take money from education. And that really became kind of the norm in terms of how finances operated in the United States. That said, these early reformers and their community partners did create a really huge network of not for profit school meal programs in rural, urban, and suburban communities across the country, such that by time the Great Depression hit in the 1930s, school meals were seen as this really important outlet for not only distributing surplus food that the government had decided needed to have like an outlet, but also a place to actually employ women. So the Works Progress Administration was a huge federally funded workforce that employed many women across the United States to cook school meals and serve them for free to students across the country. So that was the first time that the federal government really got involved in school meals, and it became a really popular thing, such that when World War II ended, legislation was passed to create the National School Lunch Act, with this dual purpose of safeguarding the health and well-being of the nation's children and encouraging the domestic consumption of nutritious agricultural commodities. And a lot of times when people talk about the history of school food, they start here and they say like the National School Lunch Program started in 1946. And technically, that's kind of true. Like that's when we got this federal law enacted. But I like to start at a different place because I think that a lot of times we're working in our communities or at the state level to push forward change. And when we start just with a moment like this in federal policy, it sort of makes it feel like this big program appeared out of thin air and erases a lot of the important struggles and contributions of people at the local level that existed for about 50 years prior to this. And so to me, it's important when we're involved in sometimes the slow work of social change to make sure that we're really paying attention to those stories of change over time and not just these very key moments in the timeline. That said, I have just a couple minutes left, and I wanted to share one, I think, really amazing activist, Jean Fairfax, who really helped to lead a community based research project across the United States during the late 1960s to show that there were so many children who really needed access to free school meals who were not being given access to those meals. So, in the report and the project that she led, they estimated that about 20 million children who needed free and reduced meals across the United States were not getting them. And that those children were primarily from Black and Brown families, mostly in the urban North and some rural communities in the South. And so they raised a lot of attention, sort of questioning why the system looked this way and why certain children were benefiting and others were not. And they were able to really push for a lot of investment in feeding kids. And what ended up happening was really they were able to expand access to free school meals. But a lot of people who ended up, I think, feeling like the quality of the food was declining, particularly during the Reagan administration when school food funding was slashed by over 25%. I think that there were a lot of people who were within that category of paid meals who no longer felt like the meals really held value for them. And school meals, I think, at least in my generation, I think started to become more stigmatized in some communities as um, a program that you participate in if you qualify for free or reduced meals. And even today, I do a lot of work with the Madison Metropolitan School District, where I am in Wisconsin, and I encounter parents all the time who are like, wait, my kids can eat in that program too. And so I feel like there's a lot of misinformation right now and still a lot of just misunderstanding about the true nature of this program really being something that is supposed to be a program that is really a public good and a program that benefits all children and families. So I think that some of the storytelling efforts that Chef Ann Foundation and others have been involved with to really change how people think about school food is really needed now more than ever to kind of fuel some of the activism that has really picked up since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'll just end because I think I'm at about time by saying that because of the way that school meals were sort of treated in the late 1960s and early 1970s as like, oh, we just have to really quickly scale up production and make sure that kids are getting something to eat. We ended up seeing a lot of these kind of heat and serve meals, like a lot of prepackaged food being served in schools, in part because the federal government made special assistance funding available to schools, but they said you can only use it to pay for food and equipment. You cannot use it to pay for labor or infrastructure. So it really incentivized a lot of schools to either, just if they didn't have existing facilities for scratch cooking, to purchase pre-made food or to invest in a central kitchen model so that they wouldn't have to spend their own money building out kitchens in schools that hadn't originally been built with them. But that said, I think that how we really unlock the potential of school meals, not only for kids in terms of their health and well-being, but for broader food systems transformation and creating good quality jobs, is by investing in what I call community-based culinary capacity. So not only the kitchen facilities, but also the actual labor time, the hours necessary, as well as the skills and training and the compensation required to keep people in the jobs to do the work. So I'll just end in the next minute or so by saying that there's been some research, not a ton, but some recently showing some of the major kind of statistics of this workforce. Just due to time constraints, I won't go through this, but you all have the slides. And there have been some efforts within some of the state level Healthy School Meals for All legislation to provide some investment in the workforce. So in California, specifically looking at kitchen and equipment upgrades, as well as an increase to the reimbursement rate, which schools could theoretically pass on as higher wages and compensation to workers. And in Colorado, they included some wage boost grants that I thought were a really innovative way to approach this. But because they ended up actually spending more money than they had budgeted on just the free school meals portion alone, those pieces related to wages and compensation have been put on hold. But still, it was part of the original framework in terms of how they were thinking about these things. So that kind of brings us to my last two slides in terms of current day. The United States Department of Agriculture has never actually funded research on the school food workforce before. They do a ton of research on looking at the meal pattern and like cost and participation rates, but nothing really specifically focused on workforce until this past year. I and Beth Katz from Food Insight Group, as well as Chef Ann Foundation, are now overseeing a $1.5 million project that will take place over the next 3 years, where we're really trying to understand the current state of the school food workforce, recruitment, retention, and job satisfaction, and how those things are impacted by different kinds of school food authority characteristics. And then lastly, and this to me is kind of the most exciting piece, USDA asked us to try to identify the most promising strategies for creating a stable and respected school food workforce that's capable of providing nutritious school meals using ingredients sourced from local and regional food systems. So I think that that's a really important sort of shift in terms of thinking about what this workforce can and arguably should be doing. But it takes public investment for us to get there. So I'll just end by saying that we did some listening sessions over the summer with a lot of different school food stakeholders to try to determine more of the priorities for how we actually should be approaching this research. And right now, we are actually soliciting applications from researchers, and many of them are actually partnering with school food professionals around the country. And we're going to be subgranting $800,000 of the award to people across the country to hopefully be getting some really high quality research that we'll be able to share back out with you about school food jobs and how we can improve them. So look for that to come from Chef Ann Foundation in the future. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And sorry, everyone, I was a bit late on my other meeting run over, but nice to see everyone's faces. Any questions for Jennifer? And if you are more comfortable putting in the chat, feel free to do that. You could also raise your hand by clicking the reaction button at the bottom and then click the little hand raise icon as well. Any questions? Anyone? No questions at all? Okay, well, we'll move on to Christina, but if a question does, or Christina, sorry, Christine, but if a question does come up, oh, it looks like we have a couple questions coming through now. Could you talk more on CBCC?
This might just be my brain being melted from multiple days of a sick toddler at home. What's CBCC?
I'm actually not sure either. Tiffany, would you mind clarifying what you mean by that? Or if anyone else knows?
And while that's happening, I can answer this question about the difficulties in the early days in school food operations. Ah, okay. So community-based culinary capacity. I came up with that term because I wanted to sort of recognize the fact that there are a number of places that are using central kitchens to support scratch cooking. But in some places, central kitchens, I think, are really used as a de-skilling tool to really reduce the amount of skill and labor that you need on site. And so I don't want to make the argument that everything has to be 100% on-site cooking, but I think that we need to have the capacity to be preparing meals more locally and in ways that engage community and really determining like what sort of foods like make sense for us to be supporting or in terms of purchases from particular like regions of the country that might not look the same everywhere, and we have different demographics in our schools. So what sort of menu items or culinary techniques might really make sense in one place versus another can be variable, and I think that the ability to work with different kinds of ingredients and to be responsive to not only farmers and other food producers, but also to the children and families that the programs serve, I think really hinges on the ability for people to be cooking. And so like I think of it as a way to also encourage people to recognize that school meals and school kitchens are community assets. And I think that we can be more imaginative in terms of how we think about using school kitchen infrastructure, and also really I think one of these questions about what were some of the difficulties in the early days in school food operations. I think financing and convincing people to really invest in school meal programs was a huge one, and I think you'll see, I guess, in the book, since it looks like you're getting that. I think a lot of that really has to do with devaluing the work of feeding people more broadly and women's labor. So I think that there's not only those issues, but also a lot of schools in the United States were built when it was more common for kids to actually be walking home for lunch. And so I think throughout, the kind of big expansion of public schooling during the progressive era, we ended up with a lot of urban schools that didn't actually have kitchen or cafeteria infrastructure in them. And so that's one of the things that made it so kind of, I think, compelling when the frozen food manufacturers and the airline industry came in and said, hey, you want to like feed all these people really quickly and you don't actually have space or equipment, like we know how to do that, like let us help you. And so like there was this big nationwide community push during what some historians refer to as the right to lunch movement to expand access to school meals. But because there wasn't also this investment in labor and in infrastructure, it ended up being really, I think, something that opened the doors pretty wide to the processed food industry to come into schools. And over time, for more and more of the jobs that people had in school meal programs to be converted from full-time to part-time positions as well. I'm going to just stop there in the interest of Christine's having time to share her wonderful wisdom.
Thank you, Jennifer. And if anyone else has questions for Jennifer, feel free to pop them in the chat as well. But we will move on to our next speaker, Christine Trin. I could pass it to you if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Christine Tran. I am the former executive director of the Los Angeles Food Policy Council, and I was a free lunch kid. I grew up eating free lunches since day one of schooling. My favorite was cubed turkey over mashed potatoes and gravy. My least favorite, and I'm Asian American, so My least favorite was actually what they tried to do for cultural connections, which was Lunar New Year. It was usually some sort of like broccoli with beef, kind of like Panda Express, but back then Panda Express wasn't a thing. So just whatever version of Chinese food you think folks would have. And just remember having a scoop of rice, but for some reason they ladled on soy sauce, like a lot of it. And it was my least favorite because I didn't know what I was eating. It was like they were trying to be culturally appropriate, but it just didn't translate well for me as a kid. And my parents came to this country as refugees. So school food for me was actually also where I learned a lot about American culture. And so in my work, it's been interesting. School food has always been a place of comfort and also a place of confusion. Like, how does this work? How do good intentions go right or wrong? And at the Los Angeles Food Policy Council. And let me actually step back a little. A food policy council is essentially a group of people getting together to figure out ways to solve problems. And one of the things that Jennifer mentioned earlier was during the Reagan administration, so many things got defunded, including school food. And so that was actually a point of time when the first Food Policy Council was created. And the reason why food policy councils came to be was because government officials were struggling to find money to support people. And then at the same time, churches and a lot of spaces where people were getting services from in the community, they were being inundated too. So everyone who just lacked resources came together to kind of figure out what each person should do in the community. And so that level of community grassroots response is ideally what a food policy council is. You get a group of people who come from different walks of life, different organizations, positions, and really figure out how can we help each other out. And so Los Angeles created a food policy council after recognizing some of these challenges. And so in the Los Angeles region, we have so much food coming in and out of our ports internationally. We also export a lot of food. In Ventura County, we have so many strawberries that get grown and then shipped elsewhere. More people in the world eat our food than we do in the state of California. And we actually grow the world's supply of like almonds. And so when we think about all of these things, we have a very like interrelated relationship with the food we have, but then also systems and really figuring out like where our food comes from and how do we create nutritious meals for ourselves and the community. And so a lot of issues around policy is difficult because policy isn't very tangible. You can't touch it, but it directs so much into what we end up seeing. And so a little bit about my background as well, outside of the Food Policy Council. I was a teacher for LA Unified School District, and when I was getting my teaching credentials, I started noticing day one of teaching why my students didn't eat school food. I taught in South LA, so everyone in my school qualified for free meals. And many of the kids were not eating it. And kind of some of the things that Jennifer was talking about in terms of stigma, kids were not eating school food because of a stigma. And then I asked myself, I was like, well, everyone here is a free lunch kid. Why is there even a stigma? And so I learned after listening to the students and really working alongside different folks at the school, the principal, the school food service workers, parents even. And I found that most of the kids did not want to eat school food because culturally they had identified it as being something bad already. So I asked the kids, like, why don't you like school food? And so the kids automatically said, oh, it's county food. I don't want to eat county food. And I was like, well, what's county food? And they're like, oh, it's food that the government doesn't want anymore. And then other kids were saying it's jail food. I was like, oh, what do you mean jail food? And the kids were saying, well, I have a cousin who's in juvie and they say they eat the same thing. And so when you think about where food comes from, it comes from, depending on who your food contracts come from, the juice box that someone gets in the juvenile justice system might be the same um, uh, juice box that you get at a school. And so the kids in the school basically did not want to eat the food, and that's why they call it county food. And I actually wrote a my master's thesis when I was getting my credentials in my master's. It was called Hot Chips for Lunch. The kids actually would rather eat hot chips, flaming hot Cheetos. It was like way before Takis. So the kids would actually eat a bag of hot chips and fruit juice, like the red punch fruit juice, no fruit juice. And that was their meal every single day at school. And they would refuse school food. And so to know that school food policy exists and then experience that as a teacher and a former free lunch kid was mind-boggling for me. Like I couldn't connect the dots. And so I've actually spent my entire career trying to piece together these puzzle pieces I've been collecting, and it's led me to work for the USDA. I worked on farm to school issues. I also did a plate waste study. It's one of the first plate waste study in our country, which I didn't know at the time, but I measured how much food was wasted for a universal free breakfast in the classroom program in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and really just sitting down with some of these things and the good intentions of policy, like school food, look so different across your country because of resources, because of programming, and how you connect the dots between things. And so, a lot of what we see and don't see, a lot of times there's these disconnections of how do we have conversations around why universal free meals are important. And when you get the right people involved, these policy councils, these groups, advocacy conversations, and advocacy conversations are just stories that we have in our minds and our hearts. And so um, just that fact of listening, and I really enjoy listening to Jennifer's presentation every time. And just that oral history of like, this happened back then. Like, how are we supposed to know what happened when, and how do we fix it? And so even this program that everyone's participating in is an example of that, of like, how can we get more information, teach each other, and have community so that we can represent the best of what we know is important to school food. And sometimes it's really hard because in policy, things get written and then people celebrate, oh, it's done. But then the hard work is actually implementing the policy, not just creating it. And so that's one thing about food policy councils that are really important. Not all food policy councils operate the same, and the concept of a council is basically people getting together. So there's not an exact definition or an exact uh, just like example of what a traditional food policy council is. So so many people start them in different ways. Many college campuses have started food policy councils because they don't like the food access that they have. It typically gets started when there's a problem and a group of people are trying to solve it. And so that's one of the reasons why the LA Food Policy Council has been so strong over the last 13 years, is because of how invested folks have been in continually having these conversations. Um, and sometimes when we think about policy, it's like, what can I do about policy? Everyone has a role in policy, whether it's voting or having a conversation, and just really speaking your mind around, like, I don't think this works, or I have an idea. And oftentimes when you have these things come together, you create something like the National School Lunch Program. And as Jennifer mentioned in her presentation, so much community building happened before an actual federal act came to be. And so that's an example of how people create policy, not policy doesn't just appear, by itself. And the great thing about the National School Lunch Act is it does get reauthorized every few years. It's been a long, long time since it's been reauthorized, but it's an opportunity for folks at the federal level to change the way policy is understood. So that's something to think about as well. As policy isn't forever. Policy is changeable. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Christine. Any questions for Christine? And again, you could put them in the chat if you'd prefer that, or you could raise your hand and ask a question.
I do have a question.
Yeah, Christine.
How how can we get our kids to get away from that stigma of that this cafeteria food is awful? They'd rather go to like the snack bar or go eat some fried chips instead of the school. I mean, I've tried everything. I've tried letting you know that we're doing scratch cooking and everything, but we still can't get that. Oh, only the kids that don't have money are the ones eating at the cafeteria. So how can I start getting these kids out of that mentality, I guess?
It's a difficult one to some degree, but it's also just about relationship building. And one of the things I found out in terms of the stigma at the school that I taught at was the kids had the stigma, but if I actually had the school food at my desk, like in the classroom, it was a safe space for them. So I actually had kids come to my class early after lunch so that they can eat the lunch that they refuse to eat, during lunchtime. And
Mm,
it's creating that safe space. And there's different types of concepts of reimagining school food interactions and, having taste tests and even creating little cafes. And if you can work with teachers, have like maybe little cafe sessions. And I've heard of programs putting out like a nice tablecloth and inviting, kids to eat and just doing little things to get them to change and have ownership of the program too. Because, if you tell kids, hey, eat this, they're like, no. But if
yeah.
it's their choice, they're like, okay, I like this. And so that part of creating buy-in is really difficult to some degree, but it's not impossible. You have to kind of like figure out what those entry points are. And when I was teaching and when writing this master's thesis too, my entire class came to class early to get food from my desk.
Oh,
And
nice.
so it's just figuring out, how do you create those spaces of comfort and buy-in so that the kids think that they're making the choice to eat and they're not being told this is what you need to eat.
Oh, okay. Because I did have an idea today. I was just talking to one of my coworkers, and I'm like, I wonder if I can actually just go into like, let's say 1 week, I'll pick the fourth grade classes and go into their classroom and ask the teacher, hey, can we do a taste test? And have the
Yeah.
kids, you know, vote on the food if they like it or not, if they like to see it
Yeah.
on the menu. But
And they can vote on it, have conversations about it. Because I think, having it interactive in that way and including teacher participation. Because as a teacher who taught hungry kids, I ended up having sandwich parties and I would go out and buy sandwiches and created like a little sandwich bar in my classroom because all of my students were hungry. And
mm,
and I'm pretty sure the teachers that you will talk to might be interested in doing some support as well because to teach a hungry kid is not easy and it's not healthy either. So I think that's a really fantastic idea.
okay, sounds good. Do I need to get a hold of like the wellness policy or I mean, because I know we're trying to implement I mean, we have a wellness policy, but it hasn't really
Hmm.
been implemented, I should say.
Yeah. I know
So
exactly what you mean. Like people have signed up on it. It sounds great on paper, but
Yes.
how's it in action? If you have teachers that you want to connect with, whoever it is on the administrative side or whoever it is teacher wise, find that entry point and make it, start something and then see how you can grow. Your idea doesn't have to be all like 100% thought out. You can just,
Okay.
like you said, start with one class, start with a handful of students. It doesn't have to be so big. But if you just start something, you never know where it's going to go.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. And it looks like we have another question from Michelle in the chat. We had a taste testing in our high school last month and we didn't receive support from our administration level at the site. How can we go about getting our administration throughout the district support us as we are trying to implement more scratch cooking?
So, this is a really good question. I'm going to echo something that Jennifer talked about in her presentation. When we think of school food, the school actually gets money. Like, for instance, if you're a Title I school, that means low-income students who are attending the school, they actually get extra money for teachers, for supplies, for other things. And the only way that a Title I school can be a Title I school is if they count how many free and reduced lunch kids they have. So it's sucks because when we think about school food, it should be a priority, but sometimes it's not. But if you think about how schools get paid to exist, they actually use the free and reduced meal categories to populate that information. And even during times of crisis, whether it's a pandemic or anything that's related to public health, people are always going to ask how many kids are free and reduced because that's the question they ask. How many kids who are low income go to the school? And so that's actually how they allocate resources. And so a lot of times with administration, because they're trained to be an administrator, school food isn't really on their radar as an area that they learned about in their training. And teachers don't learn about when I got my teaching credentials, we never talked about school food. And so principals getting credentialed in administration, they rarely, if ever, talk about school food. And so um, sometimes you have to find those entry points of like, let's have a conversation about the importance of the school food program. And maybe there are ways you can connect some dots so that they can see the value of the program in the way that you're seeing the value of the program. And again, kind of like the other question, you don't have to be big about it. It can just be small. You want to start small to change the culture and the ideas and beliefs that people might have. And I think that might be really good entry points. I don't know if you have any other insights, Jennifer.
I think I would echo all the things that you're saying. I was going to find a blog post that my school did that talked about some of the taste testing and like collaboration work that we did in the Madison Metropolitan School District because I think that there's issues in terms of institutional support and I think that schools are often really under capacity. But if any of you happen to live in communities where you have community colleges or four-year colleges or universities, I do feel like it can be a really good way to bring in like more people to support these kind of special events and stuff. So I know that in one of the classes that I was teaching, my students supported a scratch cooking pilot and did a lot of taste testing with the students. And it was just something that helped add extra capacity to the school and made the principal of the school feel, I think, more comfortable saying yes to his school, like being the pilot, because he knew that there would be people there. Like they weren't really concerned so much about the taste testing. They were actually just really concerned about the kids carrying trays with all these different foods and they wanted to have like more hands like on deck. So I can find that and put it in the chat, but I feel like it's just, it's partly just like persistence of like being told no and then pivoting and doing something different and like realizing that like the path toward change isn't always linear. I know even like in our case in Madison, we were getting a lot of really wonderful community support and even like a kind of front page story on our like Madison magazine about some of the school food changes that we were trying to implement through this pilot. And then there was like an administrative change and a couple people went out, one on leave and one took a different job, and that like tanked the management capacity of the school food program and has made it like harder for them to do anything supposedly extra. So I think it, is one of those things where it's a complex system, and I don't think there's like one single um, answer. But I think that what's so powerful about being part of a community that you all joined through this program with Chef Ann Foundation is that you're able to really learn from each other about like, maybe something's just actually kind of weird in your particular district or your school, and like somewhere else, it's not an issue, and that's helpful knowledge for you. Or maybe something is an issue like in all of your schools, and then that's something that, you want to elevate to the level of like thinking about collective problem solving and like talking with people at Chef Ann Foundation about like, hey, this is something that we're all experiencing, like how do we address this? So I think that there's just a lot of power in not being so isolated in terms of thinking about like when we do face these different kinds of barriers, how do we start to like strategize about how to overcome them, and also start to bring in like different points of evidence? Because I think that one thing that I see sometimes is that people who are in school administration can be kind of risk averse. And so seeing that something has worked somewhere else can be like hugely important in terms of moving a no to a yes. And so I think that's where being part of like just a network of people who are really committed to the same goals and sharing strategies is really how we build and overcome these challenges over time. But um, yeah, it's sometimes we get the easy wins and sometimes it's a slog to not be super optimistic, but it's both, and I think that that's why doing things in community and having people you can commiserate with is also really important.
If you're on Facebook, one of my favorite pages is schoolmeals.rock. And there's so many good ideas that folks have, whether it's using commodities or figuring out fun activities to increase just belongingness in the cafeteria. So I'd highly recommend School Meals That Rock as a Facebook like. And just, again, in this group, as Jennifer mentioned, you're in community with each other, which is great. And one of the challenges in general with school food changes is that most folks are isolated in wanting and figuring out how to change. And you might feel it in your day-to-day at your school, but in this group, you can talk about it, connect the dots, and maybe there's some solutions that you can think about that you normally wouldn't have that space to think about.
Well, thank you, Jennifer and Christine, for joining us today. We're going to wrap up with some housekeeping items so we could let you all go for the evening. Apprentices, if you could stay on the call, and Christine and Jennifer, we hope you have a great rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. So just to wrap up the call, just have a couple of quick housekeeping items. So just as a reminder, after every virtual learning session, there will be a required reflection that'll be due. So it will be due a week after the virtual learning session. So that will be next Wednesday. You will be able to find it on Moodle under the virtual learning session link itself, and in there you'll see a prompt, and you could either type your answer directly into the box, or if you'd like to upload a document to answer it, you may do that as well. And our next virtual learning session will also be January 29th. So we'll send out a reminder prior to that call, but just as a reminder, that'll be our next session. And then the final quick housekeeping item, I know we talked about this on the orientation last week, but we need to collect everyone's work schedules and worksite locations, whether you're completing hours through the apprenticeship or not. So we have 33 people who have shared their schedule and worksite location. So that means we need 14 more schedules and work sites. So I'm going to drop the forms in the chat, and we'll also share this in the follow-up. But when you have your location, worksite location and schedule figured out, please feel free to submit it using the forms in the chat. Any questions? Okay, well, we could let you all go for the evening, and thank you all for joining for our first session. We'll see you on the 29th. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
And Brenda, your hours are not due until next week, Wednesday, the 22nd, and I'll send an email about that.